My son called me on a Wednesday morning and said, "Dad, we put you in assisted living. Your room is ready. We forgot to ask, but it is for your safety." I was standing in my kitchen, pouring a cup of black coffee, when the phone rang. The morning sun was shining brightly through the large windows of the house my late wife Helen and I had built 40 years ago. It was a beautiful, quiet morning, until I heard my son's voice. Caleb was 41 years old. He was a real estate developer whose ambition had always vastly exceeded his competence. He had spent the last 5 years bouncing from one failed commercial project to another, drowning in debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of success. Over the telephone line, I could hear the muffled sound of a car engine running. In the background, I heard the sharp, frantic voice of his wife, Tessa, giving instructions to someone. Caleb was speaking very quickly, stringing his sentences together with a practiced, breathless urgency, like an actor rushing through a poorly written script. "I know this feels sudden, Dad," Caleb said, his voice dripping with that synthetic, patronizing tone people use when speaking to a frightened child. "But Tessa and I have been talking, and we found an absolutely wonderful facility. It is called Willowbrook. We already booked the room. The transport team will be at your house tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I set my coffee mug down on the granite countertop. I did not say a word. "We have already started moving some of your things," Caleb continued, talking over my silence. "This house is just too big for you, Dad. The stairs are dangerous. You have been so forgetful lately. You are living alone. We just want you to be safe. Please, Dad, do not make this hard. My name is Edward Whitaker. I am 69 years old. I am a widower. My wife, Helen, passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack. But before I retired, I spent 35 years working as a senior estate attorney in the state of Illinois. I did not write simple wills for suburban families. I specialized in aggressive probate litigation. I spent my entire career dismantling fraudulent conservatorships, exposing forged signatures on property deeds, and destroying relatives who tried to financially abuse the elderly. I had seen every variation of human greed. I had cross-examined men and women who thought they could outsmart the law simply because the person they were stealing from had gray hair. And now, my own son was trying to run the exact same con on me. "You forgot to ask me before moving me out of my own life," I asked. My voice was low, perfectly steady, and devoid of any emotion. There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line. Caleb cleared his throat. "We forgot to ask, Dad," Caleb replied, trying to sound gently authoritative. "But we did not forget to care. This is the best thing for you." It was the most mathematically perfect lie I had ever heard. It framed a kidnapping as an act of profound familial love. I did not scream at him. I did not cry. I did not threaten to call the police or tell him that I would fight him in court. When you spend 35 years in litigation, you learn that anger is a tactical disadvantage. You never warn your opponent that you are holding a loaded weapon. "All right, Caleb," I said quietly. "Send me the address." I hung up the phone. I stood in the silence of my kitchen, looking around at the walls that had sheltered my family for 4 decades. This house was not just a piece of real estate. It was a living, breathing archive of my entire life. I could still see Helen standing by the back door, covered in sawdust from building the bookshelves in the study. I could still see the faint, faded pencil marks on the doorframe where we had measured Caleb's height every summer. This was the house where we had celebrated promotions, mourned losses, and built a legacy. My son did not see any of that. To him, the hardwood floors, the bay windows, and the memories were just a mathematical equation he could liquidate to solve his own problems. I did not drink my coffee. I walked out of the kitchen, down the long hardwood hallway, and into my old study. The room smelled faintly of old leather and the pipe tobacco I used to smoke. I walked directly to the heavy, floor-standing steel safe tucked behind the mahogany bookcase. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I knew exactly what I was going to find before I even spun the combination dial. If Caleb was confident enough to book a room at an assisted living facility, he had already laid the legal groundwork. He could not force me out of my house unless he had somehow secured the legal authority to act on my behalf. I spun the dial, pulled the heavy steel handle, and swung the door open. The interior of the safe had been meticulously rifled through. The original deed to the house was gone. My comprehensive medical directive was gone. The thick manila folder containing the most recent amendments to my trust was gone. The copy of Helen's last will and testament was gone, and the small brass key to my secure deposit box at the downtown bank was gone. Caleb and Tessa had not just forgotten to ask. They had been systematically robbing my safe for months, quietly building a parallel legal universe where I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. I closed the safe and locked it. I stood up and walked over to my desk. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the dim light of the study. I clicked on my email inbox. Sitting at the very top of the list, unread, was an automated message from a prominent local escrow and title company. I clicked on it. "Congratulations on your pending transaction," the email read. "This is an automated notification to confirm that the final closing for the Whitaker residence has been scheduled for Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. All authorized signers must be present." I stared at the screen. The cold, mechanical reality of the email washed over me. They were not just moving me into a facility. Caleb's real estate business was failing. He was drowning in debt. He needed a massive injection of cash to save himself from bankruptcy. My house was sitting on a highly desirable 2-acre lot in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the county. It was fully paid off. It was worth nearly $3. He was selling my house from right under my feet. He was going to lock me in a medical facility on Thursday, execute a fraudulent power of attorney at the closing table on Friday, liquidate my entire life's work, and walk away with the money before I could even figure out how to use the phone in my new room. He thought I was just an old, lonely widower mourning his wife. He had completely forgotten who I was. I opened a new email draft. I typed in the address of Gideon Shaw. Gideon was 72 years old. He was a ruthless, brilliant litigator. We had spent 15 years tearing each other apart in courtrooms across the state, fighting over million-dollar estates. We respected each other immensely, and when Helen died, Gideon was the only person who had sat with me in silence at the funeral. I typed the subject line in all capital letters. Whitaker Trust Emergency Lock. I attached 5 encrypted files to the email. The first file was the complete unredacted clause of my living trust. The second file was a notarized medical competency certificate I had acquired from an independent neurologist exactly 3 months ago, proving I possessed absolute cognitive function. The third file was a hidden, secondary addendum to the property deed. The fourth file was a digital copy of the original house title. The fifth file was a formal, legally binding trigger instruction. I did not write a long, emotional explanation. Gideon did not need one. He spoke the exact same language of legal warfare that I did. I typed the body of the email. Gideon, they moved before I died. Activate everything. Edward. I hit send. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the front lawn. Tomorrow morning, a transport van would pull into my driveway. My son and his wife would walk through my front door, pretending to be heartbroken, preparing to drag me away. They thought age had made me helpless. They forgot age had made me experienced. My son thought he had forgotten to ask me. What he had really forgotten was that I wrote the trust he was trying to steal. After I sent the email to Gideon, I sat in the silent study and let my mind drift backward over the last 6 months. When you spend your life analyzing financial fraud, you learn that criminals rarely execute a complex theft overnight. It takes time to build a false narrative. You have to lay a foundation of plausible deniability. You have to make the people around you see exactly what you want them to see. I thought about my daughter-in-law, Tessa. Tessa was a lifestyle influencer on social media. She spent her days curating a pristine, highly edited version of reality for her thousands of followers. She knew exactly how to manipulate lighting, camera angles, and emotional narratives to generate sympathy. 6 months ago, she had suddenly started visiting the house much more frequently. She played the role of the devoted daughter-in-law flawlessly. She brought me fresh flowers. She insisted on organizing my pantry, and every evening before she left, she would brew me a special herbal tea she claimed was for sleep support and joint inflammation. "Drink it while it is hot," Edward Tessa would say, flashing a bright camera-ready smile. "It is an organic blend. It will help you relax." I had trusted her. I had drank the tea. Shortly after the visits started, I began experiencing strange, unpredictable symptoms. Some mornings, I would wake up feeling overwhelmingly lethargic. I would struggle to find the right words in conversations. I experienced dizzy spells when walking down the hallway. Whenever these episodes occurred, Caleb and Tessa always seemed to be standing right there. "Dad is declining," Caleb would whisper, shaking his head sadly whenever my 24-year-old granddaughter, Mara, came over for Sunday dinner. "We are doing the best we can, but it is getting harder." And Tessa was always holding her phone. She claimed she was just checking her emails or responding to followers, but I realized now what she had actually been doing. She had been recording me. She was filming me when the tea made me stumble, when my words slurred, when I looked confused and exhausted. She was gathering B-roll footage for the most important production of her life. Caleb had used my apparent cognitive decline to gently pressure me into signing what he called temporary care documents. He told me it was just a precaution, a way for him to help me pay the utility bills and manage the lawn service if I ever had a bad week. They had not been helping me. They had been slowly, methodically building a paper cage around me. I stood up from my desk and walked into the living room. I walked over to the small, decorative wastebasket, sitting next to the leather sofa. It was the only trash can in the house that the weekly cleaning service had not emptied yesterday. I tipped the wastebasket over, spilling the contents onto the hardwood floor. I put on my reading glasses and began sifting through the crumpled receipts and discarded junk mail. It only took me 5 minutes to find the physical architecture of their conspiracy. Buried at the bottom of the pile was an empty, unlabeled amber plastic prescription bottle. I opened it and smelled the faint, chalky residue inside. It was not organic sleep support tea. I slipped the bottle into my pocket. Later that evening, I would have Gideon send the residue to a private laboratory for a toxicology screening. It would come back as a highly restricted, pharmaceutical-grade sedative not issued in my name. Tessa had been grinding it up and dissolving it in my hot water. Next to the bottle was a glossy, full-color brochure for the Willowbrook Assisted Living Facility. Then I found a crumpled, discarded printout of an email draft. It was from Tessa's personal account addressed to Dr. Sterling, the private physician they had recently insisted I see. The email read, "Dr. Sterling, Caleb and I reviewed your preliminary assessment. We need stronger language about cognitive decline in the final report to satisfy the court requirements for guardianship." But the most damning piece of evidence was a single sheet of standard printer paper folded in half. I unfolded it. The entire page was covered in ink. Someone had traced my signature over and over again, easily 50 times, trying to perfectly replicate the exact loops and angles of the letters. They were not just planning to force me into a facility. They were actively forging documents to steal my estate. I heard the front door unlock. I quickly gathered the evidence from the floor, shoved it into the pocket of my cardigan, and stood up. My granddaughter, Mara, walked into the foyer. She was 24 years old, currently in her final year of law school. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, and had always been the light of my life. But as she stepped into the living room, and saw me standing there. Her body language completely changed. She stiffened. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for signs of a mess. She looked at me not with love, but with a cautious, heartbreaking fear. "Hi, Grandpa," Mara said, her voice tight and unnaturally calm. "Dad told me you were having a really bad day. He said I should come over and make sure you did not leave the stove on." I saw her hand slip into the pocket of her jacket. I saw the faint glow of her smartphone screen through the thin fabric. She was turning on the camera. Caleb had prepared her. He had probably sent her a text message right before she walked in. "If Grandpa sounds angry, do not argue with him. Just record it. It will help the doctors understand his condition." He was using his own daughter to gather evidence against me. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive or outraged. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up a thick blue legal folder, and held it out to her. "Mara," I said, my voice perfectly steady, projecting the calm, authoritative tone I had used in courtrooms for 35 years. Before you record me, I want you to read the first page of this folder." Mara hesitated. She looked at my face, searching for the confusion and the agitation her father had promised her. She did not find it. She slowly pulled her hand out of her pocket and took the folder. She opened it and began to read the dense, heavily formatted legal text on the first page. It took her less than 30 seconds to realize what she was looking at. She was a law student. She understood the terminology. "This is a trust document," Mara said, her brow furrowing in confusion. "But it says the Whitaker Family Preservation Trust is the sole legal owner of this property. I do not understand. Dad said the house was in your name. He said you were struggling to pay the property taxes because you kept forgetting to write the checks." "Your father is a liar, Mara," I said simply. She looked up at me, shocked by the bluntness of the statement. "But he said—" "Read the third clause," I interrupted, pointing to the document. Mara looked back down and read the clause aloud. "The primary residential property cannot be sold, transferred, or leveraged while the grantor, Edward Whitaker, is alive and competent. Any modification to this clause requires live, notarized consent in the physical presence of the designated trust counsel." She looked up again. Her eyes were widening as the legal implications began to click into place. "Read the emergency contingency clause," I instructed. Mara flipped to the next page. "If there is documented evidence of coercion, fraud, medical manipulation, or unlawful restraint against the grantor, the trust automatically enters an emergency lock protocol. All assets are immediately frozen." She stopped reading. The color began to drain from her face. "Your father and Tessa have been drugging my evening tea for 6 months," I said, my voice quiet but razor sharp. "They have been filming me while I was under the influence of sedatives to build a fraudulent medical profile. Tomorrow morning, they are going to force me into the Willowbrook Assisted Living Facility. And on Friday morning, they are going to a title company to finalize the sale of this house using a forged power of attorney." "No," Mara whispered, shaking her head. "No, that is impossible. Dad loves you. He said he was doing this to protect you from falling down the stairs." I reached into my cardigan pocket. I pulled out the empty sedative bottle, the email printout demanding a harsher medical diagnosis, and the sheet of paper covered in forged signatures. I dropped them onto the glass coffee table in front of her. "Your father was not trying to protect me from the stairs, Mara," I said. "He was trying to protect the house from me." Mara stared at the evidence on the table. She looked at the forged signatures. She recognized Tessa's handwriting in the margins of the email printout. "Read the final beneficiary clause of the trust, Mara," I said gently. "The one detailing what happens after I pass away." Mara slowly turned to the last page of the document. She read the bold text, and she stopped breathing. "The primary beneficiary of the Whitaker Family Preservation Trust is Mara Whitaker." She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "It is me. But Dad said, he said the house was his inheritance. He said it was his safety net for the business." Your father is 41 years old, I replied. He has bankrupted 3 commercial projects, and he expects me to liquidate my life to pay for his incompetence. I wrote this trust 6 years ago to ensure that the wealth your grandfather and I built would skip a generation. It was meant to pay off your law school loans. It was meant to buy you a house. Your father is not just trying to steal from me, Mara. He is trying to steal your entire future. Mara dropped the folder onto the table. Her hands were shaking. She reached into her purse and pulled out the family iPad she had brought over to help me set up some audiobooks. She unlocked the screen and opened the cloud storage application. She clicked on a hidden folder labeled Medical Updates. Inside, there was a subfolder named Grandpa Episodes. She clicked on it. Dozens of video thumbnails appeared on the screen. Mara clicked on the most recent one. The video began to play. It showed me sitting in the kitchen chair, my eyes half closed, my head nodding. I looked terribly old, frail, and completely unaware of my surroundings. It was the night Tessa had made me 2 cups of tea. But Tessa had been careless. She had not edited the audio track yet. As the video played, Tessa's voice could be heard clearly from behind the camera, speaking to Caleb in a harsh, calculated whisper. "Keep asking him what year it is," Tessa's recorded voice instructed. "Do not stop until he gets it wrong. Make sure he says the wrong date. The judge will love that when we file the guardianship papers." Mara stared at the iPad screen. A single tear rolled down her cheek, followed by a look of profound, absolute disgust. She had just watched her own parents systematically drug and exploit her grandfather for financial gain. The illusion of the caring, worried family shattered completely, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth of their greed. Mara turned off the iPad and set it down on the table. She wiped the tear from her face. When she looked up at me, the fear and confusion were entirely gone. She was looking at me not as a scared granddaughter, but as a law student who had just been handed a smoking gun. "What time is the transport van coming tomorrow?" Mara asked, her voice cold and completely steady. 8 o'clock in the morning, I replied. Mara nodded slowly. She picked up the trust document and tucked it safely into her leather satchel. "I will be here at 7:30, she said. "I am going to bring my own camera, and I am going to let them dig their own graves." I looked at my granddaughter. She was brilliant, and she was brave. Caleb had severely underestimated both of us. "They are not moving me into care, Mara," I said quietly as she walked toward the front door. "They are moving me out of the way, and tomorrow morning they were going to find out exactly what happens when you try to move a brick wall." The white transport van pulled into my driveway exactly at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning. It had the words Willowbrook Assisted Living painted in soft, calming blue letters on the side panels. I stood in the center of the living room, wearing a simple gray cardigan and holding a small overnight bag. I did not run. I did not barricade the door. I simply waited. The front door opened, and Caleb walked in, followed closely by Tessa. They were both dressed impeccably, looking exactly like the exhausted, devoted children of a failing parent. Caleb had dark circles under his eyes, carefully emphasizing the burden he was supposedly carrying. Tessa was holding a clipboard, her face pulled into a mask of tragic concern. "Dad," Caleb said, his voice dropping into that synthetic, patronizing register. "The transport team is here. They are very nice. They are going to take you to your new room." He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Do not be dramatic about this, Dad," he whispered gently. "We packed your favorite sweaters. We made sure you have a window view." I looked at him. I did not pull away from his touch. I stood slowly, intentionally leaning heavily on the wooden railing, adopting the posture of a defeated, confused old man. I let my eyes drift toward the floor. "Okay, Caleb," I murmured, my voice intentionally frail. Tessa walked over to the front door, where 2 transport orderlies in medical scrubs were waiting. She held up her clipboard, speaking to them in a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "He may resist," Tessa warned them. shaking her head sadly. The doctor warned us that he might become combative during the transition. Just be gentle with him. He does not fully understand what is happening. I understood exactly what was happening. I was letting them build their own gallows. Mara walked down the staircase. She was wearing a thick sweater, her hands tucked deep into the pockets. She looked at her father, then at me. I could see the tension radiating from her jawline, but she played her part flawlessly. She did not argue with them. She simply fell into step behind us as the orderlies gently guided me out the front door and into the back of the white van. The drive to Willowbrook took 30 minutes. Caleb and Tessa followed closely behind the van in Caleb's expensive luxury SUV. Mara rode in the passenger seat with her father. When we arrived, the orderlies escorted me through the sliding glass doors of the facility. Willowbrook was marketed as a luxury senior living community, but beneath the faux marble floors and the acoustic ceiling tiles, the reality was inescapable. The air smelled sharply of clinical disinfectant and overcooked food. It was a holding pen for the forgotten. We were led into a small, brightly lit admissions office. The intake director, a woman with a tight smile and a thick stack of paperwork, sat behind a large mahogany desk. Caleb and Tessa stood directly behind my chair. Mara stood quietly near the door, her hands still buried in her sweater pockets. "I need the final admission signatures," the intake director said, sliding a thick packet of stapled documents across the desk toward me. "This authorizes the facility to take over medical dispensing, and it legally transfers the daily duty of care to our staff." Caleb leaned over my shoulder. He placed a heavy, expensive fountain pen onto the desk, right next to the paperwork. "Just sign, Dad," Caleb said. His voice soft, but laced with an undeniable, heavy pressure. "Then everyone can stop worrying. You will be safe here." I looked at the paperwork. I looked at the pen. I knew that Caleb and Tessa assumed my hearing was failing along with my mind. In the parking lot, just before we walked into the building, Caleb had pulled Tessa aside. He had spoken in a low, rapid whisper, completely unaware that Mara was standing right behind his SUV with her cell phone in her hand, the audio recorder running. Mara had captured every single word. "Once the intake is complete, the facility controls access," Caleb had whispered to his wife. "We close tomorrow morning, clear the debt, and he will adjust." "It is done, Tessa. We won." He had already spent the money in his head. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy fountain pen. I slowly pulled the cap off. I rested the tip of the pen against the signature line on the first page of the intake packet. Caleb let out a slow, quiet breath of relief. Just as the ink touched the paper, the telephone on the intake director's desk began to ring. It was a sharp electronic chirp that shattered the tension in the room. The intake director frowned, looking at the caller ID. She picked up the receiver. "Admissions," she said. She listened for 5 seconds. Her tight, professional smile completely vanished. The color drained from her face. She looked up at Caleb, then down at me, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. "What?" she stammered into the phone. Yes, I understand. We have not signed the final admission." "I will halt the intake immediately." She slammed the receiver down. She reached across the desk and physically snatched the paperwork out from under my pen. "What is going on?" Caleb demanded, stepping forward, his voice suddenly hard and aggressive. "We have an appointment." She was just about to sign. "I cannot process this admission, Mr. Whitaker," the intake director said, her voice shaking slightly. "Our legal department just received an automated electronic notice. It was sent simultaneously to our facility, the county clerk, the local Adult Protective Services office, and the probate court." Caleb stared at her. "Notice of what?" The heavy glass door of the admissions office swung open. Gideon Shaw stepped into the room. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase in one hand and leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane with the other. Standing directly behind him was a uniformed court officer. "Notice of contested guardianship and trust lock." Gideon said, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the sterile walls of the office. Caleb spun around. He did not recognize Gideon immediately. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb snapped. "We are having a private medical meeting. Get out of here." "I am Gideon Shaw," he replied, stepping further into the room. "I am the designated secondary counsel for the Whitaker Family Preservation Trust. And as of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, that trust is in a state of emergency lockdown." Gideon looked past Caleb and nodded respectfully at me. Then he turned his attention to the intake director. "Mr. Whitaker will not be admitted to this facility today," Gideon stated with absolute, terrifying authority. "Furthermore, any attempt by you, your staff, or his family members to restrain him, medicate him, or prevent him from leaving this building after this legal notice has been served will be treated as unlawful detention and prosecuted as a federal felony." The intake director swallowed hard and pushed her chair away from the desk. "He is free to go," she said quickly. "We want no part of this." Caleb's face turned a violent shade of red. He lunged toward Gideon, his fists clenched. "You cannot do this," he shouted. "I am his son. I have a medical directive from Dr. Sterling stating that he is cognitively impaired. I have the legal authority to place him in care." Gideon did not flinch. He leaned on his cane and looked at Caleb with the cold, detached pity of a predator looking at a very stupid prey. "I did not do this, Mr. Whitaker," Gideon replied calmly, adjusting his grip on his cane. "Your father did. 6 years ago, when he wrote the contingency clause you were too arrogant to read." Caleb froze. He turned his head slowly, looking back at me sitting in the chair. I did not look frail anymore. I set the fountain pen down on the desk. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders, and looked my son directly in the eye. The illusion was over. "You," Caleb stammered, the realization finally crashing through his engineered reality. "You knew." I stood up from the chair. I walked past him, ignoring his shock, and stopped in front of Gideon. "Is the lock secure?" I asked. Gideon nodded. "The county clerk has frozen all property transfers related to the primary residence. But there is a complication, Edward." Gideon opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. He handed it to me. "Your son has become incredibly desperate," Gideon explained, keeping his voice low, so only Mara and I could hear. "The escrow company informed me that Caleb aggressively pushed the closing date forward. The sale of your house is still scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the downtown title office." I looked at the documents in the folder. Caleb had secured a buyer, a luxury condominium developer named Preston Vale. The purchase price was $2.8 million. "He knows the trust is locked now," Mara whispered, stepping closer to us. "He knows you are not in the facility. He will cancel the closing. He knows he is caught." Gideon shook his head. "You do not understand how deep his debt goes, Mara. If he does not secure this capital tomorrow, his creditors will destroy him. If we simply block the facility and walk away, he might panic. He might run to the escrow office tomorrow morning and try to force the sale through using forged documents before the title company fully processes the trust lock." Mara looked horrified. "But that is a felony. That is massive real estate fraud." I looked at the closing documents. I looked at the forged signatures Caleb and Tessa had practiced in my living room. I knew exactly what they were going to do. They were terrified. They were drowning, and they believed they had gone too far to turn back. "Then let him sign," I said quietly. Mara stared at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Grandpa, what do you mean? If he signs those papers, he is committing a massive crime." I closed the manila folder and handed it back to Gideon. "I know," I said. "When you spend 35 years fighting financial abuse, you learn a very hard truth about the justice system. It is very difficult to prosecute someone for thinking about committing a crime. It is very difficult to put someone in prison for planning a theft. A clever defense attorney can always argue that the suspect was just confused or that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But a signature on a binding legal document changes everything. A signature is absolute. Fraud is much easier to punish, I explained to my granddaughter, my voice hard and uncompromising, after it stops being an intention and becomes an act. Mara looked from me to Gideon. She understood. We were not going to stop Caleb from walking into the escrow office tomorrow morning. We were going to let him sit down at the closing table. We were going to let him raise the pen. My son had built a cage out of paper, so I let him walk into one made of signatures. The downtown office of the Sterling and Vance Escrow Company was designed to make people feel wealthy before they had even signed a check. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows, brushed steel accents, and a massive mahogany conference table in the center of the primary closing room. At exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning, Caleb Whitaker was sitting at the head of that table. Tessa was sitting next to him, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. She was playing the role of the exhausted, dutiful daughter-in-law with absolute perfection. Across the table sat Preston Vale, a ruthless luxury condominium developer who specialized in tearing down historic suburban houses to build multi-unit glass boxes. A real estate agent, a banker, and a licensed notary public were also seated around the table, reviewing the thick stacks of paperwork. "My father is already in care," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a solemn, respectful register as he spoke to the buyer. "It has been a very difficult week for our family. But the house is simply too large for him. This is what he wanted. It will cover his medical expenses and give him peace of mind." Preston Vale nodded sympathetically, picking up his expensive gold pen. "It is never easy," he murmured, "but you are doing the right thing for him." The escrow officer, a middle-aged man with graying temples, pushed the final authorization document toward Caleb. "This is the primary transfer deed," Mr. Whitaker, the escrow officer, explained smoothly. "Since you are acting as the sole authorized agent under your father's power of attorney, we just need your signature here on the bottom line. Once this is signed and notarized, the buyer's funds will be released from escrow, and the transaction will be legally binding." Caleb picked up his pen. His hand was trembling slightly. I could imagine the intoxicating rush of relief flooding his veins. In 3 seconds, $2.8 million would erase every mistake he had ever made. He leaned over the document and pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. Caleb froze, looking up. I walked into the room. I was not wearing the gray cardigan I had worn for the transport team. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, the silver cufflinks Helen had given me on our 20th anniversary, and a look of absolute terrifying clarity. Gideon Shaw walked in directly behind me, leaning on his silver-handled cane. Mara followed closely, carrying her heavy leather satchel. Caleb dropped his pen. His face went entirely white, all the blood draining from his cheeks in a single, horrified instant. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. Tessa gasped, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. "Dad," Caleb stammered, scrambling to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting at the facility." I stopped at the end of the mahogany table. I looked at the closing documents, then at the buyer, and finally at my son. "I rested long enough for you to become careless, Caleb," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel. Before Caleb could respond, the computer terminal sitting on the escrow officer's desk emitted a loud, piercing chime. The officer glanced at his screen. His eyes widened. He clicked on the notification, reading the text rapidly. The email had been sent directly from the legal department of the Whitaker Family Preservation Trust. The subject line, written in bold red letters, flashed across the screen. "Whitaker Trust Emergency Lock. Execute immediately." The email contained 8 encrypted attachments, the primary trust clause restricting the sale of the house, the 3-month-old medical competency certificate proving my mental acuity, the legal hold notice issued to the Willowbrook facility, The toxicology report I had ordered on the empty sedative bottle found in my trash. Mara's audio recording, and a formal notice from Gideon Shaw warning that any party proceeding with the transaction would be held civilly and criminally liable for real estate fraud. The escrow officer looked up from the screen, his face pale and sweating. He looked at Caleb, then at Gideon. "This closing is suspended," the escrow officer said, his voice shaking. He reached across the table and physically pulled the transfer deed away from Caleb. "The property cannot be transferred. The earnest money is frozen." Caleb panicked. He slammed his hands down on the table. "You cannot do this," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am his son. I have a medical directive. I have a notarized power of attorney." Gideon Shaw stepped forward. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out the power of attorney document Caleb had submitted to the title company, and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. "Yes," Gideon said, his voice rumbling with quiet menace. "Let us talk about your power of attorney, Mr. Whitaker." Gideon pointed a long, bony finger at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a magnificent forgery. Tessa had spent hours practicing the sharp angles of my handwriting, carefully replicating the slope of the letters. To a standard notary, it looked identical to my signature on my driver's license. But I was an estate attorney. I had spent 35 years dealing with forged documents. I knew that the greatest defense against a forgery is not complexity, but a hidden, unbreakable habit. "Look closely at the letter W in the name Whitaker," I instructed, speaking directly to the escrow officer. The officer leaned over the document, squinting at the signature. "For 40 years," I explained, "every time I sign a legal document, I place a microscopic, deliberate dot of ink directly inside the first downward angle of the W. It is completely invisible unless you are looking for it. It is my signature trap." I pulled my driver's license out of my wallet and set it next to the forged document. The escrow officer pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and examined both signatures. He looked up at Caleb, disgust radiating from his eyes. "There is no dot on the power of attorney," he confirmed. "You forged the shape of my name, Caleb," I said quietly, staring into my son's terrified eyes. "But you forgot the habit behind it." Tessa stood up, her face flushed with panic. "He is crazy," Tessa screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He is delusional. Look at the videos I sent you. He does not even know what day it is." Mara stepped forward. She did not argue with her father. She simply reached into her satchel, pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker, and placed it on the table next to the forged document. She tapped a button on her smartphone. The audio recording she had taken in the parking lot of the Willowbrook facility began to play. Once the intake is complete, the facility controls access. Caleb's recorded voice echoed loudly through the silent conference room. "We close tomorrow morning, clear the debt, and he will adjust." The silence that followed was suffocating. Gideon opened his briefcase again and began dropping documents onto the table like a judge handing down a sentence. "Here are the text messages between your wife and Dr. Sterling, demanding a harsher medical diagnosis," Gideon said, dropping a stack of printed emails. "Here is the draft listing agreement you signed with a real estate broker 3 weeks before you even approached your father about temporary care documents. Here are the financial records detailing your $3 million commercial debt, and here is the preliminary deposit Mr. Vale wired into your personal checking account." Preston Vale, the condominium developer, stood up abruptly. He grabbed his gold pen and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He looked at Caleb with absolute contempt. "I am a businessman, Mr. Whitaker," Preston Vale said coldly. "I tear down houses. I do not buy into elder fraud." He turned and walked out of the conference room, slamming the heavy glass door behind him. The banker sitting at the table immediately pulled out his cell phone and dialed his compliance department. The escrow officer hit a button on his desk phone, signaling the building's security team. 5 seconds later, the side door of the office opened. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, accompanied by a plainclothes investigator from the county's Adult Protective Services Division. Gideon had called them 20 minutes before we walked into the building. The trap had completely closed. There was no escape. There was no argument left to make. Caleb's engineered reality had violently collided with the cold, unforgiving machinery of the law. Caleb collapsed back into his chair. He looked at the police officers. He looked at the forged documents scattered across the mahogany table. And then he looked at me. Tears were streaming down his face. The arrogant, patronizing real estate developer was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken little boy who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. "Dad, please," Caleb sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Please do not do this. I was trying to save my business. Tessa is pregnant, please. You are destroying me." I looked at my son. I felt a profound, agonizing sorrow in my chest, mourning the man I had hoped he would become. But I did not feel an ounce of pity for the criminal sitting in front of me. "No, Caleb," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, echoing with the terrible finality of a judge reading a verdict. "I am not destroying you. I am only refusing to be inherited before I die." I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving my son sitting at a table that one email had turned into a crime scene. The legal fallout from the suspended closing at the escrow office was absolute and merciless. When you attempt to steal $3 million using forged legal instruments, the justice system does not view it as a family dispute. It views it as a major felony. Caleb and Tessa were indicted on a staggering list of criminal charges. The district attorney filed counts of elder financial abuse, forgery, attempted unlawful guardianship, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the unauthorized administration of a controlled substance. The consequences stripped them of everything they had built their engineered realities upon. Caleb's real estate developer license was permanently revoked. Without the stolen capital from my house to satisfy his massive commercial debts, his remaining creditors tore his business apart in bankruptcy court. He went from projecting the image of a wealthy tycoon to being a penniless, publicly disgraced criminal in less than 48 hours. Tessa's downfall was just as complete. When the edited videos of my manufactured dementia were entered into public record, along with her frantic text messages demanding a harsher medical diagnosis, her social media empire collapsed. She lost her brand sponsorships. She lost her followers. She was permanently exposed as a fraud who drugged her own father-in-law for profit. The state probate court formally upheld the emergency protocol of the Whitaker Family Preservation Trust. The house was taken completely off the market, and a judge officially recognized my granddaughter, Mara, as the protected primary beneficiary of the estate. 2 days before his scheduled plea hearing, Caleb's attorney submitted a formal request. Caleb wanted to see me. Gideon Shaw advised against it, just as he always did, but I told him it was a meeting I needed to have. You cannot simply cut a rotten branch off a family tree without looking at the wound one last time. I met my son in a small, windowless visitor room at the county courthouse. He was sitting on the other side of a scratched plexiglass partition, wearing a faded orange county jail uniform. He looked exhausted, defeated, and much older than 41. I sat down in the plastic chair opposite him and picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. He picked up his. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I was trying to protect you," Caleb finally whispered, his voice trembling, as he repeated the lie he had been telling himself for 6 months. "I did not want to hurt you, Dad, but the house was just too much for you to manage. The money was just sitting there. You did not need it. I did." I looked at him through the scratched glass. He still did not understand. He genuinely believed that my assets were simply resources waiting for him to claim them. "It was not sitting there, Caleb," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "It was waiting for someone worthy." Caleb's face twisted into a mask of bitter resentment. "Tessa is 7 months pregnant," he spat. his voice rising, trying to use the one weapon he thought I could not defend against. She is going to give birth while I am in a state penitentiary. You are doing this to us. You are punishing your own grandchild. I did not flinch. When you have spent decades dismantling abusers, you become immune to the weaponization of guilt. No, Caleb, I said quietly. I am protecting that child from learning that love means theft. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up against the plexiglass so he could read it. It was a legal certificate establishing a new, highly restricted educational and medical trust. I had funded it with a substantial amount of my personal savings. The sole beneficiary of the trust was Caleb's unborn child. I have ensured that your child will have their medical bills paid and their college tuition covered, I told him, watching his eyes scan the document. But there is a secondary clause. You and Tessa will never, under any circumstances, have administrative access to a single penny of this money. It is locked in a fortress that neither of you can ever breach. Caleb stared at the document. He realized that I was not a cold, vindictive monster. I was simply a father who loved his family enough to surgically remove the cancer from it. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a crushing, pathetic sorrow. He pressed his hand against the plexiglass, tears streaming down his face. Dad, please, he sobbed. I am still your son. I looked at the hand pressed against the glass. I remembered holding that hand when he was a little boy. I remembered teaching him how to walk, how to read, how to ride a bicycle. But the man sitting across from me was a stranger who had tried to erase my existence for a paycheck. A son asks before moving his father out of his life, I said. I hung the receiver up, stood from my chair, and walked out of the visitor room. I never looked back. Caleb accepted a plea deal later that week. He was sentenced to 7 years in a state penitentiary. Tessa tried to use her pregnancy to avoid jail time. But the judge was utterly unsympathetic to a woman who had systematically poisoned an elderly widower. She received 18 months in a state facility to be served after the birth of her child, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. As the bailiff led them out of the courtroom, Tessa frantically reached out toward Mara in the gallery. I did this for our family, Mara. Tessa cried out, tears streaming down her face. Mara did not flinch. She stepped back, looking at her mother with absolute freezing contempt. No, Mara said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. You did it for a house that was never yours. When the legal dust finally settled, Mara and I returned to the house together. It was strange walking back into the living room. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an impending threat. It was the silence of a house that had survived a storm. We spent the entire afternoon undoing the damage Tessa had done. We walked from room to room, peeling off the bright yellow and red sticky labels she had aggressively slapped onto my furniture and belongings. Labels that read facility, storage, sell, and donate. In the corner of the dining room, sitting under a pile of old newspapers, I found a heavy cardboard box. Caleb had written the word trash across the top of it in thick black marker. I opened the box. Inside, carefully wrapped in old tissue paper, were my wedding albums, the photographs of Helen and me cutting our cake, smiling at the camera, completely unaware of the heartbreak the future held. Caleb had been perfectly willing to throw 30 years of my happiest memories into a landfill just to clear the house out a few hours faster. I took the albums out of the box and placed them gently onto the dining room table. Mara walked into the room, holding a trash bag full of discarded sticky labels. She looked at the albums, then looked around the massive, quiet house. What do we do with the house now, Grandpa? Mara asked softly. It is so big for just the two of us. I looked at my brilliant, brave granddaughter. She was going to be a phenomenal attorney. We open it, I replied. 2 months later, we transformed the entire ground floor of the house. We moved the dining room table out, replacing it with a large conference desk. We brought in filing cabinets, a heavy-duty printer, and a coffee station. We bolted a polished brass plaque next to the front door. It read, Whitaker Elder Justice Clinic. It was not a massive corporate law firm. It was a specialized, highly aggressive legal clinic dedicated to a single purpose. Gideon Shaw, Mara, and I provided free, comprehensive legal assistance to elderly men and women who were being targeted by their own families. We helped people who were being forced to sign power of attorney documents they did not understand. We dismantled fraudulent conservatorships built on fake dementia diagnoses. We fought the children who tried to cut off their parents' communication, who slowly drained their bank accounts, and who tried to push them into lockdown facilities to steal their homes. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, an 81-year-old woman sat across the conference desk from me. She was terrified. Her daughter had recently moved in with her, ostensibly to help her recover from a minor surgery. But the daughter had secretly changed the mailing address on her mother's primary bank account and was currently trying to finalize the sale of the mother's downtown condominium. The elderly woman handed me a stack of heavily redacted escrow documents. My daughter told me it was just a reverse mortgage application to help pay for my nursing care, she whispered, her hands shaking. I put on my reading glasses. I scanned the first page of the document. Then I flipped to the second page, where the dense, convoluted transfer clauses were buried in fine print. I looked up at the woman and offered her a cold, reassuring smile. Do not worry, I said softly, sliding the document over to Mara so she could begin drafting the injunction. They always think old people do not read the second page. That night, after the clinic was closed and the house was quiet, I walked slowly up the hardwood stairs to my bedroom. For the last 6 months, ever since Tessa had started making me the sleep support tea, I had developed a paranoid habit. Every night, I would lock my bedroom door, terrified that someone was going to come into my room while I slept and steal the rest of my legal documents. I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the brass lock. Mara walked down the hallway, carrying a cup of hot chamomile tea. She stopped, smiled at me, and gently draped a soft woolen blanket over my shoulders. Good night, Grandpa, she said. Good night, Mara, I replied. I watched her walk into her own bedroom. I looked out the hallway window, watching the rain fall gently against the glass. I took my hand off the lock. I left the bedroom door wide open. They tried to move me out of my own life. Instead, I changed the locks, opened the windows, and stayed.